setting the context and again being playing a very important role in having the 49th SusTalk. And, uh, and I'm very excited because uh, I'm uh, I'm given the role of moderator to talk with the three wonderful entrepreneurs I have known. And of course, I'll be talking to Manisi for the first time, but Abilash and myself have been on multiple panel discussion together. And of course, Swapnil and myself were part of a panel discussion in Climate Picks, and definitely super thrilled to know about all the work that they're all doing, and being in the same field of water and climate action in general. This is exciting to be here. So I will start, of course, with a brief context on water. Since we are talking about net zero as an important point in this panel discussion, I don't know how much all of you agree, but I always felt if climate change is sharp, water is its teeth, right? I mean, if you think of when we have a warmer planet, what happens to the hydrology, what happens to the evapotranspiration. Are we living in the, I mean, we are all probably living the same place where Ashoka to Akbar built cities here, right? But are we living in the same place where the water availability was there when these cities were formed, right? My belief is that it is not. So though the geographically we are in the same cities, but the water availability has drastically changed for various things, not just only about climate change. Climate change is important aspect, but also rapid urbanization. I mean, I remember watching a old Govinda movie where he says he's going to Bangalore for honeymoon, right? I mean, today nobody would like to come to Bangalore for honeymoon, neither because, I mean, whether it's a weather or the water availability or whatever you talk about, right? So places have changed because of rapid urbanization as well and various other factors. With this context, and of course, water has its own implication on various other aspects, right? I mean, today I was just stuck in a traffic jam because there was a water tanker blocking the route, right? It's totally something related to traffic. Urban mobility is connected to something to do with water availability. I've been recently told that, of course, groundwater is not at all supposed to be utilized for drinking. It is supposed to act like a sponge when there is an earthquake, right? Of course, the borewell came to India in only 1972. Earlier to that, there was no borewell, right? I mean, and when recently in Karaikal, there's a cholera outbreak, and that happened because there was a fresh water connecting into sewage. So it has a health impact on health, right? So water by itself might be should not be seen in silos, and I think this discussion is also to understand how probably unfortunately water crisis or a climate change related aspect on water is underappreciated and it's not given due importance. So I am here with all the some of the most committed entrepreneurs in this space. So I'll start, of course, with alphabetical order with Abilash. I would like to hear a quick introduction about yourself and your work, and then I'll go with Mansi and then with Swapnil.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for showing up on Saturday morning. So my name is Abilash. By way of education, I'm an engineer, but by way of profession, climate entrepreneur. And I don't like using the word climate entrepreneur, just entrepreneur works, because I think we kind of give ourselves a little bit of leeway when we say climate entrepreneur. But that being said, I've been in the water space for the last 7 years almost right now. And the premise behind building a solution like ours is that it is definitely a resource that needs to be managed. And for us to manage this resource better, we need more data, which does not exist, or it exists at a very surface level. So what we're doing is we collect granular data about people's consumption. People, you can then extrapolate into a congregation of people, which is a building, who reside in buildings. So all types of buildings, residential, commercial. And we collect this data and give them insights on how to save water. We detect leakages. We make people more accountable for their water consumption by telling them, hey, you pay for your own water. We're used to this with electricity because the reason why we don't leave our ACs on all the time, because we get a bit. We don't do this with water so much. And then we're also building a very large database. We collect about 36 million data points per day for water consumption, which will also help design more water efficient communities in the future. With this rapid urbanization that Ganesh was talking about, I think there is a huge need to manage water better. And we are looking to solve it using data and trying to get more people more accountable. And I'm sure that Swapnil and Mansi are doing the same, but slicing it a little differently. So I lead it on to Mansi, I guess. After that.
Thanks, Abilash. Great to hear. I mean, always inspired by your work. So thanks again for joining. Mansi would definitely like to hear about your work in water. Over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Ganesh. And yeah, it is the first time we're chatting, which is surprising. But thanks everyone for joining. I guess a little bit of background on me. I was always very interested in urban problems specifically, just because I think growing up in Gurgaon, it's very apparent how resource consumption is going to be more and more of a challenge. So, I remember growing up, we didn't have any way to deal with waste. The incinerator in the city had actually burnt down for, I think, 6-7 years, and I'm not sure there's a solution even now. And so just thinking about how these things are going to start getting more and more difficult to manage with climate change, with population growth, got me really interested in thinking about water and waste. And then around 2 years ago is when we began working on Digital Paani. And the way we're trying to tackle the water problem is that we're focusing on wastewater. So the premise here is that wastewater is the only source of water which is local and renewable everywhere. And you can actually meet 65-70% of water needs if you manage this resource right. And it's very, very untapped right now. And the great thing about it is that it tackles two different problems within water. One is, of course, dealing with a scarcity problem because you can actually substitute out fresh water. And the second is dealing with pollution of fresh water that happens because untreated wastewater goes and contaminates it. And yeah, I think the way we see it, this is going to be very core to building climate resilience going forward, because 90% of the effects of climate change are actually going to show up through the pathway of water. And then within wastewater as well, where we really focus is on operations. So generally what happens with infrastructure and with water infrastructure in particular is that you have all of these assets already existing, but 75-80% of them are actually not able to operate properly. And that's because of a variety of different problems. You don't have technical expertise, you don't have the skills, you don't have the data, you don't have the systems to actually manage such complex assets where you have biological processes, chemical processes, electrical processes, and so on, all together in one tiny asset. And so that's what we're really trying to target. So the idea is that if we can get these facilities to operate, we can actually meet a lot of our water needs. So it's kind of the analog of energy efficiency, I would say, in the energy space.
Thank you so much, Mansi. I think this was the most important problem in water, and glad somebody like you solving it. And I've been told 70% of water in our country is contaminated, while that 70% of water is also consumed at some level, right? And I think you're solving a much bigger problem of even safeguarding health. You're ensuring that treatment is done right. Thank you so much for joining. Again, Swapnil, over to you. Please give an introduction about yourself and your work. Very excited to hear.
Yeah, thank you, Ganesh, and thank you, Abilash and Mansi, and fellow people who have joined this online session. Very good morning to everyone. So I think first, a bit of background on what Ganesh was speaking about, that, like we have these cities which were built from times of, Ashok to Akbar, and then even before that, Romans had built a lot of these cities. And we have been following kind of a similar model, which was developed many thousands of years back till today. And, that was one premise which actually led to us start thinking of new and innovative solutions in the water space, maybe more from a technology perspective, but also what implications it could have on how we source, distribute, and treat water. So I'm co-founder of Uravu Labs, and at Uravu, we are trying to address the problem of groundwater depletion by finding a more sustainable alternative. And we call our solution as renewable water, where we tap into moisture in the air and using only solar energy produce really high quality water, which then can be used for drinking, production, and industrial applications. So the idea is again trying to address the problem at source, where you can not only look at uh, reducing freshwater consumption from sources like depleting groundwater, but also find a way where you can also address issues like logistics, transportation. You might not find water tankers in roads if you have these kind of solutions. And I think in this water space, uh, Mansi and Abilash also will agree, and even Ganesh will agree that we need a portfolio of solutions, because the diversity in problems itself is huge. So water being a element which touches all our lives and all our industries and all our society as a whole, they're not like a silver bullet solution to many. So I think it's the diversity in the problem itself which is coming, helping us realize so many different innovative solutions. So really glad to be with you guys today.
Thank you, Swapnil. I mean, absolutely, there's no silver bullet, and that's why we need more water entrepreneurs.
Yes,
I think very glad also that the government of India recently did the Amrit 2.0, got 75 entrepreneurs in water, and I'm glad that all of us are also part of that
yes,
things trying to solve. And I think we should have more water panels and get more people into the space. Considering the fact today's discussion is also on net zero part, how water plays an important role, I would like to individually ask one by one. I mean, I'll start with Swapnil with you on how do you see water and net zero? I mean, why should water also be seen very seriously in this space in achieving net zero? And please let me tell, you can also talk both from the mitigation as well as adaptation point of view, because water is not necessarily only on the mitigation side. In fact, I believe it is more on the adaptation as well. So, but this conversation on in the various conferences, whether the climate conferences, why we should bring this up, and what are your thoughts on that? And would like to hear it from you.
sure, sure. Definitely, Ganesh. What I believe is like there has been a good momentum in what maybe society as a whole, and then it's going to corporates and in individuals who are trying to get to net zero. But a lot of these targets are still lot very much focused on carbon emission, because that's a measure which I think is also easier to do, and is also in the society as a whole has been targeted very much. CO2 emissions have been linked to a lot of global warming and climate change. Water usually gets removed from a lot of these discussions. One is also because it's problems are always more local in nature, and the effects could be not felt by the corporates or even the policy or decision makers as a whole personally. So I think water definitely needs more room to highlight those issues. And towards the net zero, I think water has been or should be considered one of these core targets. Because what happens is, whether you take energy, mobility, or even agriculture, even though they have certain carbon emissions linked to it, water plays a huge role in all of these industries. So we talk about the energy water nexus, or food energy water nexus. If one thing gets affected, it affects the other three pillars as well. So I think net zero definitely has to be looked at a more holistic manner, not just on a carbon emissions perspective, but also consider water, both from a standpoint of how much water we are using and how much we could substitute with solutions like maybe wastewater treatment, renewable water, or some other solutions. And then data plays a part where you can actually account for what you're doing. So if you're having those interventions, which are say helping us reduce or save water, solutions like FluxGen and then from WeGot actually help us measure that. So I think it needs a whole perspective change from corporates and policymakers, where they start incorporating water in a lot of these more net zero targets, because without that, it would be impossible to actually bring those positive changes, which can't be you're thinking of just bringing through reducing carbon emissions. So I think that's the perspective I have. on net zero.
Thanks, Swapnil. Thank you so much on that part on the holistic aspect that you mentioned. Would love to hear from Mansi, her thoughts on water and net zero. How would you look into it, Mansi?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I would look at it both from adaptation and mitigation standpoint. So I think from adaptation standpoint, water's role is very clear. So yeah, 90% of the effects of climate change reflect through water. And it's obviously the key resource which is involved in any production process or, I mean, existence in general. And so I think securing water resources is going to be very key to the adaptation process. And so if you look at any subsystem which is going to be affected because of climate change. So for example, food or agricultural production, it is largely through the pathway of water. So water plays a big role there, I think, and that's where I guess our focus comes in on wastewater because you can build that resilience locally if you have more circular utilization of water. From the mitigation standpoint too, the water is significant. So this is not very well quantified in India, but in the US, for example, water infrastructure accounts for 2 to 3% of the energy consumption and emissions. And so it's pretty significant. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to reduce energy intensity here of the water infrastructure. And there's a lot of different pathways to do that. So one is directly reducing energy consumption in this infrastructure. Second thing is reducing distribution and logistics involved in water, which is where I think Swapnil's kind of initiative comes in as well, because distributing is a very significant energy cost. And that's also part of what my interest in wastewater comes in, because if you have those local loops, then again, you can cut down a lot of that transportation and distribution costs and emissions. And yeah, I think those are the two primary ways in which I look at it.
Thank you, Mansi. I mean, while we have already realized that climate, I mean, it has that kind of impact, only 0.05% of total climate investment has gone into water. So that will probably be the next question. But I would like to hear from Abilash. Abilash, you said that you don't want to consider, you want to call yourself as an entrepreneur more. But since we are in a conversation with various stakeholders, especially in climate field, I'd definitely like to understand from you on water and net zero, on how do you look into it and from the work that you're doing at WeGot.
So obviously, I think water has a big role to play in the whole net zero conversation, and it's woefully underserved. I also look at it as, how do I make this conversation more louder? How do I make water a more inclusive part of it? And that's how this whole thought process around WeGot came, right? Because for us to make any decisions, you want to base that decision on data. I mean, you see a lot of things, but for you to start making decisions, we want data to be made available. So that's how the thought process of WeGot came in. And also, for me, from a water and net zero perspective, I think we need to look at it as a more decentralized solution than a very overall umbrella net zero conversation. Because in that conversation, water gets lost. I mean, either due to the abnormally low cost of water, which, I mean, some things we don't have enough control of. That's a socio-political conversation. But irrespective, it is an artificially low-priced commodity, and when it is a low-priced commodity, you're not going to give it as much priority as, let's say, energy or some of the other things to get more priority. So it feels like, to me, the answer to some of this is to more decentralize the water conversation at as small a level as possible. I mean, whether it's building or a smaller ward. I mean, I don't know what the smaller breakups are, but to me, a building seems like the smallest level that you can kind of decentralize it and have that conversation, and then build policies around that.
Thank you so much, Abilash. I know we've been talking a lot on why is this that big asymmetry. I mean, there's I think all climate change problems has to be mitigated and you have to work towards it. But why is this disparity that water being such an important component in this whole climate change conversation, but when it goes to stats, only, as I told you, globally, I think only 0.1% of climate investment has gone in water, and in India, it is 0.05%, even less. And while India has consumes 18%, I mean, India has 18% of the world, but our availability is only 4% of water. Still, the India should have been on the at least slightly on a better side in investment in water. And we know the challenges in India, like 70% of water, as I said, is contaminated. And by 2030, there'll not be enough water. Only 40% of our country would not have water. So many projection on these things. And we also see now interconnectivity of water challenges on health, on even as something distant as earthquake but still, this is so skewed. I mean, if it is even in a single digit, it would have been something, but it's less than a single digit, 0.05. So I want to hear, how do we inspire, as we all have to build a water market, right? I mean, all 75 entrepreneurs and various other 100 entrepreneurs who want to get into this. We have to build this market together and inspire confidence among investors that this sector needs that kind of importance. So I'd start with Mansi. How would you inspire or create that kind of aspiration in investors to invest in water sector as a whole and build theses on water as we are talking about climate change?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here. One is that, like, historically, business models in water have been challenging just because it's public infrastructure. It is very costly as well to move around or transport water. And largely it's dealing with public utilities, and everyone knows, payment cycles there can be unpredictable. Cash flow problems can really plague startups in the space. And decision-making cycles in general are just really slow, because when you're experimenting with water, you're experimenting with literally the lifeline of any city. And so it's not easy for any utility to adopt a new solution. So I think, historically, that aversion to investing in water has made sense. But given the fact that it is such an important part of the puzzle, I think it is important for that picture to start changing. And I do see that change happening. I think I see most funds at least beginning to come up with a thesis or beginning to see this as the next major area where something is going to have to happen. So I think a lot of it is just about cracking, like figuring out the exact leverage points within water where you can have a scalable business model. So I think for all three of us, actually, like, one of the interesting things is that our business model looks very different from what you might imagine as like traditional water, where you're selling to utilities. So I think if you figure out nodes where you can sell to private markets, then that actually forms a much better investment opportunity for investors. And yeah, but I do overall see that move happening amongst funds as well. And I think in the next 1 or 2 years, this is definitely going to be a space where a lot of growth will happen. And also, I think one last thing I'll say is it's about timing as well. So for us, at least, there are two primary drivers which enable like business to really move forward. So one is water prices, and then the second is compliances. And broadly, like neither of those things a couple of years ago were at the level where you can actually really make a really solid and scalable business. But I think that's definitely changing in the last 3-4 years. And yeah, the market is kind of on our side in this space. So
thanks, Mansi. I agree. I think the factors that you mentioned has definitely created I mean, investors are looking into it. I would like to now ask Abilash. I think, Abilash, you are like a flag bearer in water sector, right? I think you got the highest, you raised highest amongst all, and everybody looks up to WeGot for the amazing that you guys have done. Can you share your thoughts on this question on how did you inspire investors to take up investment in water, and what do you think, what is the message that you want to share?
Sure. So I'll tell you first, I think what their challenge is, right? In general, climate tech and more specifically water has a lot of hardware involved, right? And that is generally a little bit harder to scale than a pure play software solution. And there are various components, like you have to worry about supply chain, you have to worry about deployment on field. It's not a single solution, it's not a pure play software solution. So scaling of this is a little bit harder. I mean, it's obviously visible that it's difficult to scale, but not difficult, it's more challenging to scale. So I think that's one of the reasons why investors have taken a little bit more slower than some of the other segments. But like Mansi said, I think that is starting to change. And I think what will drive them even more is policy changes, like compliance, like you said. And also some way to enforce a compliance. Like I know in Bangalore, for example, there's been a geo that mandates buildings to measure their water and report it. But it's not really enforced as strictly right now. So once that enforcement starts happening a little better, then instead of us going and pushing a solution out, you start seeing that pull effect, right? And then scale starts to happen. And then at the end of the day, I mean, investors still will have to show returns and give back. I mean, there's a exit price and all of that, right? So to make that work, um, there needs to be maybe policy becoming more strictly enforced or some way where you're able to show significant growth consistently year on year. That's one. And for us personally, I think also when we first raised money, uh, it didn't feel like there was venture capital money available. So we raised more strategically, someone who had a more long-term vision in and understanding what are the problems, saying, hey, you know what, this is a problem, we understand it, and it's not something that will get solved in 3 years or 5 years. You need a lot longer time frame than that to solve this. So and these are fairly large established corporates, and when they backed us, it gave us a lot more credibility, and that gave us a little bit more scale. And then now we're at a point where we're more VC fundable, right? Because that time frame is important when who you take money from. So I'll say now with the changes that are coming in, I feel like everybody, uh, it's right for um, raising more capital. And raising capital is not the only metric, but it is important because that's what drives innovation, right? You want to get better talent. You want to be able to reach more people. You want to have more feet on the ground. You want to market the solution. You want people to know that, hey, this is a big problem, right? Uh, so for that reason, raising capital is important. And I think now with this flip of the switch in mindset, I think we're going to see more people uh, raise capital and then more people enter the water space.
Thank you, Abilash, on that note. As I said, many times when I talk to people, WeGot has raised this much amount of money to inspire investors. So you've been a very important player in this space. Swapnil, I would like to hear your thoughts on how do you make water a lucrative investment for investors in the future?
Sure. Thanks, Ganesh. So first, I would like to tell that Mansi and Uravu, like we have this one common set of investors. So Peter, you always know me very well. So I think one thing we have realized is you can't attract everyone. Okay, like there are definitely certain VCs who won't give you even a minute of your time. They're not at all interested in water. They might be interested in climate, from a different perspective, but not water. So I think in finding those set of investors who are really interested and maybe passionate about what you're doing in water or climate as such is hard. Okay, it's not impossible. There are some brilliant investors and very supportive investors out there, but it's hard. And I think Mansi also touched upon a topic of timing, because so we started just playing around with this idea in 2016, 2017, and we had a really hard time even trying to get investors listen to it, right? Because no one was really looking at water. People were and especially in India, where water is so cheaply and available everywhere, people used to tell me, I just dig a borewell and get water. Like I don't have to think about all these things. So, but the narrative has really shifted from 2019 and 2020 onwards, where climate change as a narrative has occupied all of our minds, and water has kind of got lifted, like maybe got a boost in the conversations all around. So I think investors have started also responding to it. And from a VC investment perspective, I think, like water at certain stages has used, getting that kind of support. So for us, especially, it was because it's a more hardware deep tech technology. How do we, get to a stage where it becomes at least commercially viable for certain applications? And what we also are targeting or focusing more is more towards commercial and private applications, where we can justify first the cost of that extra cost, the premium which might have to be paid compared to say groundwater or other solutions. Plus also it gives us a boost in terms of reaching that scale and reducing the technology risk, where it could be then useful for more applications, for say utilities or government applications. So I think that's the pathway where VCs are also trying to see whether you have that initial boost from private and commercial players, and then as you go along, is there a wider scale you can reach with government or utilities? And same analogy we can draw from solar PV as well. Like initially, a lot of these projects were more disparate and applied in niches. But then government policy and regulation really helped boost it. So investors also got the confidence that solar is an industry where you can invest and make some good ROI. And now water should be something that regulators and policymakers should be looking at, so that that boost is there for investors' confidence as well. So I think these are the parameters going forward, and all business models are going to be quite different. Some will be focusing on commercial, some residential, some more on utility scale. But I think overall it will start with more, if we can show more traction in private and commercial sectors, and then move to more utility or government projects where the sales cycle might be slower, but then your volumes are much.
Thank you, Swapnil. I think these are very valuable points, and I know Shamila will call me now if I don't come towards the closing remarks. But I just want to add one point before you all share your closing remarks. See, in 2010 I used to work with a company called Celco Solar, and at that time I was introduced to microfinancing, and it was always called as the impact, and this is doing for the bottom of the pyramid. It's not a main. I mean, it's seen always like, oh, he's doing something good in the microfinancing. But today, when you talk about it, it's a new industry called fintech, right? The kind of today, I mean, the deal flow in fintech happened drastically high in last few years. So what is impact today actually will become a mainstream in future. There are some people who would be able to see it, that how this will become. I mean, I'm sure there are various stakeholders who see that how is this going to become a mainstream tomorrow and a mainstream investment. I think I'm glad that we all are in this field as we are evolving and building, and while it's going to become mainstream, right? I mean, investing in water security or water risk, or solving for water. I mean, wastewater is not really waste, right? I mean, it's a very important chunk of water. It's very obvious that everybody should be knowing it, and how without measure you can't manage. So, I mean, and because groundwater is not there forever, you have to find other source of water, what you're doing at Swapnil, you doing Swapnil. So I think it is time. I mean, hopefully this discussion that we are having can also come across as maybe a white paper together we can author and involve few more people and try to help the community. It's just not there. We can't just expect somebody to start investing in the sector, right? We have to put our own effort. I'd be happy if we can initiate through this thing. I would happy to start a Google Doc, and we can start scribbling around and help get future entrepreneurs in water comparatively better access to scale their business. So with that, I would ask the last question. I should also say Priya helped me come up with these questions, many of these questions, thanks to her. So I would like to hear your closing remarks on the way forward in water, and how do you look at it? Ideally, a single line or shorter phrase would be good in interest of time. And meanwhile, I request all the audience to share your question on the chat, and we would be, or you can raise your hand, we can put you on. Okay, we'll start with Mansi.
Sure. I guess I see two primary trends or things that I think need focus. One is decentralization in water management. In general, I don't think centralized systems are going to be able to cope up, especially in rapidly urbanizing areas in emerging markets. And so there's a need to figure out how to manage and source water in a more decentralized way. The second trend or area that I think needs more work is operations. So again, like you have all these assets, water is always going to be asset and infrastructure heavy. How do you actually manage it? And I think data is one part of it. Data is the entry point. but data needs to be actually used to change processes, change workflows, actually change how operations happen. So that's where I think more and more focus needs to go, as opposed to, for example, new technologies or new infrastructure, or ways of designing infrastructure.
Thanks, Mansi. I think, Swapnil, would you like to share your thoughts? And then I'll ask
Yeah.
Abilash to follow.
Sure. So I think one definitely, decentralization is a good way forward. But just to add to that, I would also like to, like make sure for any businesses or, for Uravu also going forward is how do you crack some of these value propositions to the wider market? Because I think, that the communication plus also the education part of it has still only scratched the surface. The awareness around water and maybe what we're doing through these kind of, webinars and, going forward as well, the awareness and education around water is still something which is, I would say, barely there. So how as entrepreneurs and, people working in water sector, how do we drive that conversation and bring it more to mainstream is, I think, what will enable that kind of dialogue and then ultimately acceptance and then transformation towards these, more sustainable options. So I think that would be one thing which, as organizations, we should focus on. We can't let only CO2 narrative win over water. So I think that will be one, major thing I would like us to take up.
Thanks, Swapnil. Abilash, your thoughts?
Um, the way I see scale happening for companies in water is actually collaboration, because there is not one solution, right? We've all agreed that there is no silver bullet. And we've also all agreed that at this point in our journey, we don't have the ability to go service government projects, right? So none of us are actually working there. So everybody is actually trying to get scale in the private business. And I will also be the first one to say that, if you're working in a space like water, you cannot ignore the government for too long. If you want real big scale, they have to be a very large player in that thing, but in that journey. But in today's conversation, I would say the way to achieve scale for everybody is to find other solutions, because everybody is individually pushing a solution to the same target audience in different fields. Maybe there is a way for us to collaborate, and that will help scale come in faster. It brings in more credibility. Once scale comes, more money comes, more talent comes, more innovation comes. And then you'll also have the money to go and service government contracts. So to me, I think the way about this is to collaborate a lot more. And the second thing is persistence. I mean, we're entrepreneurs for a certain reason. Like we're optimistic always, sometimes overly optimistic, right? And that's the nature, that's in our DNA, right? But till it actually changes, we still have to keep being persistent, right, to achieve some sort of scale. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not going to hold my breath saying, okay, hey, I can see the change. So continue being persistent and dig deeper.
Thanks, Abilash. I know I'm already 5 minutes ahead of time, but so thanks again for all of you. If I have to say my closing remarks, and I think I always thought water is like a time bomb. It is ticking, and we have not given enough this one. I mean importance to it, and I really don't want. We have to detonate. I mean we have to avoid it from blasting, right? So I think I'm glad that we have been able to build enough water entrepreneurs in part of Mafia, and request all of you to also bring in more people to Mafia. We have to build a larger water group and build a narrative that is understandable and valuable for the stakeholders. I'll stop. Shamil, I request you to stop the recording here so that I can open up questions. Thanks again, all of you, for your thoughts. Okay, I think you can stop.